Good evening, everybody. We're going to go ahead and kick off. So, I want to welcome everyone. This is a special event for us. Normally, the group meets once a month, but we take South by off because for anyone who attends it, you just know that it consumes your life. It wreaks havoc in downtown Austin. So, normally we wouldn't do a meetup, but we had a special opportunity to have Erin come in and give us a little preview of a workshop that she's going to be running tomorrow. I've had the chance to talk with Erin right now, and I'm completely amazed that she's going to be doing an interactive sort of presentation style. So I'm really excited to see how that's going to turn out. Erin's going to talk. Erin, I don't really have anything else to say, so I'll turn it over to you, and I'll let you describe the workshop for tomorrow. So.
Great. Hi, can everyone hear me okay?
Yeah.
Just okay? Okay, I'll try to talk. Unfortunately, because I do the document camera thing, it's difficult for me to hold a microphone at the same time and draw, so I'm not that talented. So I was actually invited here today for tomorrow by Agile Velocity, where are they in the room? There they are. So there's a couple gentlemen here. And I was really excited when they reached out to me. I've actually known them for a while. We run into each other in the Agile circuit. And they invited me here to share one of my passions as of late, which is something that I kind of refer to as product discovery. And if you're free tomorrow, you can still join us too. It's going to be awesome. And I don't have plans for coming back, so it's going to be a whirlwind tomorrow. But what I am going to try to do tonight is the session that we're having tomorrow is actually something I've taught in 2 weeks, but then I've also taught in a week, and now somehow they've convinced me that I'm going to attempt to teach it in a day. And so this evening I'm going to try to give you a preview in an hour. So it's like, I don't know how that's going to work. But as I said, I like to use kind of an interesting technique, which is this document camera that I really do, while I have in my brain many, many different sorts of information that I want to share with you guys. And instead of guessing exactly what you guys come with through your experience, I hope that at any point if you hear something, please, I know every speaker kind of says, interrupt me, really. Like interrupt me, I can change the presentation on the fly, so we can kind of make this a little bit together. So a little bit about myself. So my name is Erin Beierwaltes. I hail from Colorado, out of Boulder specifically. And my background, so I guess this is the why you should believe me part, right? Is I've done a couple things. So I've done the traditional Agile coaching route. I played that for a long time. I did program management. Actually, we were just talking, I'm getting back into software development. I was just having an interesting conversation about the last time I wrote code. I was actually writing applications, like installed applications. What's that? And I'm getting back into actually app development and possibly starting a company. So I guess you could also call me a startup founder. Along with that, so more recently, I guess my day job, or one of my day jobs, is actually a company called Design Culture. And this is part of kind of my longer journey. When I was traveling around the Agile circuit, I kind of discovered something. When I first got into it, I worked at a company. How many of you have worked for companies that do this? Anyone? Come on. Wow, that's awesome. But there's not enough, to be honest, the more I ask that question, there's less and less, or maybe you just don't want to admit it. So the traditional kind of waterfall process, I started there. And what I found was that people, when you go into companies, especially ones that actually, I wanted to do a quick hands. How many of you are in what you would call an established company? Just so I get kind of that, okay? And then how about startups? Okay, so that's kind of the other half. Good, so that's good for me to know. So actually, I started my journey in a startup. So I spent about 5 years in a startup, and I helped them when they started scaling, right? What happens in the first times you start feeling pain from scaling, and you're getting more and more people, and there's this magic number, if you didn't know, right around 50 to 75 people when you go, we need process. We need process and we need lots of it. And I'll be honest, this was before the Agile Manifesto was signed, and so we did what we thought good nature company would do, is unfortunately we put something that would look like this in place. Now, we didn't know any better. We're like, well, we need some process. Later, I got the opportunity to realize that Agile was a much better way to go. So how many people consider themselves using Agile practices in their company? Great. Okay, so most people. So we're familiar with that. I'm taking a little bit of a license that we have a certain level of knowledge in the room, right? So we know kind of what those Agile practices are. When I got into the Agile practices, I realized that there was something interesting going on. So we put these 2-week sprints in, or we were using Kanban or something like that, and we needed, we had this backlog, and at some point, we delivered something that was supposed to be awesome. But the problem is that we fixed something very specific, which is we delivered things on time and on cost and all of these processy sort of things. And what I started realizing is that we got really, really good at delivering crap really fast. Okay? And anyone? Yes, crap really fast? Good. So we're still in agreement. So there was something that started emerging, right, in the world that started saying, hey, process is okay, but we need to go back and look at a little bit of product. We need to kind of understand why we're building these things and how we're engaging people and, what it is that we should really build. So not the how to build it the right way, but what's the right thing to build. And so this product kind of revolution started. So we've seen that really with a lot of the lean startup movement, okay? The last thing I noticed, and if how many of you are familiar with Scrum Masters, right? So Scrum Masters, without realizing it, they were playing a very specific role and one that was kind of missed. And we're starting to see some improvements in the area, but it can get better, which is in all of these places, right? People are doing these things. So the coaching aspect, it's a lot more, right? I call myself an Agile coach. Right, we're coming in and we realize that there's this foundational piece, which is the team. We want to be, people already use the words. It's I want to be collaborative. I want to work in a co-working space. We want to come together as meetup groups. It's the people piece. So the problem is that we're still going after process. We're still building frameworks. We're still going, what's the process I need to follow that happens to get me these other two things? Which in reality, it's really just kind of a piece of the puzzle itself. Make sense? Cool. So I'm curious, when we talk about product itself or processes, what are some of the things you guys are using today? Any frameworks or approaches, or what are some of the buzzwords you guys are hearing out there, like good practices to get your products out?
Home interviews, customer interviews.
Great.
Podcast. Podcast.
One of them is in the name of your group.
Experiments. Yes, sir. Behavior development.
Value? Behavior?
Personas.
Great. Typing.
Lean.
Design thinking or design research.
Great.
Deep. Shared understanding.
Oh, I love that word. It's one of my favorite to say all the time. Cool. So that's pretty good. We'll start with that. So we've got this big list of stuff, right? And the problem, and I think, what I was in the kind of synopsis is there's all of these practices, right? This stuff, everyone's like, well, you should experiment. You should get out of the building. You should do customer interviews. You should do design thinking. You should do lean startup. You should do, and it's like, you should do Google's approach. You should do Facebook's approach. And right, whose head is about to explode? And then I think a lot of people I've seen, so actually one of the things that I forgot to admit to mention is with the work I do at Design Culture is actually going into the established companies and helping them figure out how to do these in their old world. Now, the other half of my job is I'm a program director at an accelerator in Boulder, so I'm convincing new companies that they should also try to do this, right? And on both sides, right, the trouble is on both sides, startups should not always do what big companies are doing, and vice versa. So who does what? What are we supposed to do? And there's everyone's kind of giving advice to everyone depending on, and they're forgetting the fact that we have different products, we're different companies, we live in different states. Frankly, Boulder's different than Texas, and people just start getting really lost. And there's a lot of, has anyone heard some of the fun words for like when you're not doing some of the Agile practices right? Scrum butt. They're like, I do scrum butt, right? Here's some nodding. And it's a bummer because if you think about even some of those original Agile practices, it wasn't about doing Scrum. What were some of the practices that were embedded into Agile that they were actually using? Scrum practices?
Time boxing?
Great. I was going to say stand-ups, time boxing.
Retrospectives?
Huh?
Retrospectives.
Retros. Great. So that's good. So, again, they came with these great practices. So the tough thing is that when we get to trying to deliver an actual product, so I'm going to go back to this here. So this really is what I refer to as a delivery cycle. It's something that is a little bit more repeatable. We know what it is that we want to build, and we can put an actual process around it. But when it comes to actually discovering what it is we want to build, when we start needing to do our build, measure, learn loops or whatever, design thinking loops, whatever you want to do, you can't start applying those same sort of approaches or processes to that product thinking, okay? So this is what I refer to as, sorry, you'll have to ignore that piece, is the discovery phase. It's everything, and it's all that experimenting and using these sort of practices to figure out what it is that you actually want to build. Okay. So now you're thinking, well, crap, what do I do with that? I have a gigantic list of stuff, right? Like, what am I supposed to start? I can't go back to my company and be like, here, I figured it out, we should do this. Okay. Well, so here's the good news. I love arranging things and drawing pictures. And I started realizing, talking to a lot of people, and what I saw was a lot of arguments between process experts or approach experts or people that were so bought into their thing that they missed the fact that there really was kind of an overarching thing that has been around for a really long time. Okay? And while there's going to be, here's the bad news. There's no process that's going to help you, that you can follow step by step, that will help you deliver a product well. But what you can do is understand the different approaches and the things you want to pull out of your toolbox one. Okay. So it is true that Lean Startup actually did a pretty good job of distilling it at a very, very high level. So they were right when they were thinking, hey, there really is this build, measure, learn cycle that we go through no matter what. Now, if you've been doing any sort of organizational development and process as long as I have, this wasn't actually new. So here's the first thing. The secret I'm going to tell you is that everyone is right. And every framework is actually just teaching the same thing that's already been taught. And if you've been kind of, watching kind of the cycles of companies, right? People, they say people stand on the shoulders of, giants. And we keep coming up with a new way to teach things, which as far as I'm concerned, if someone wants to use design thinking versus lean startup versus a thing that just came out of Google, at the underlying foundational level, it's still teaching the same things. So you can't really go wrong. But I want to show you guys how those are actually kind of mapping over themselves. So the build, measure, learn loop, is anyone familiar with PDCA? From old? Yeah? It's that plan, do, check, act. Right? So if you didn't know, so it's from Deming. Everyone's heard of Deming? Yeah, so Deming, so some of the original, all the way back to organizational development, they knew long time ago that really as humans, we go through this cycle of we plan something, we have an idea, we plan it, we do it, and then we check, and then we act. Sound a little bit familiar? Right? So there's kind of a, we plan, and then we do, and then we check, and then, we act a little bit in here. Oh my gosh! Lean startup wasn't as new as we thought it was. But that's okay. I actually don't care if everything is related in some way. If it's making sense to you, then keep using lean startup. So who knows design thinking? Has anyone heard of? So there's a little bit, right? A couple people. So design thinking is kind of a cool one. So design thinking actually came out of IDEO. So IDEO is responsible for, they're actually they're a design firm in California, and they actually developed the very first Apple mouse. So a lot of the products, consumer products you have today, including like toothbrushes, were actually designed by these folks, okay? They kind of have their design hand and everything. And when they went back and they figured out why are they so successful, they went back and they said they actually run, they were very open. They said, hey, we'll tell you exactly how we do our process. This is how we do it. First we empathize, and then we kind of define what it is that we want to do. We try to come up with ideas and we ideate on it. Prototype it, and then finally test it. Sounds similar again, right? So the funny is there's a lot of people out there like, have you done design thinking? Have you done this one? This is the one that will get your product because they have these things. Well, I started thinking, I'm like, well, actually, they kind of did have a couple of extra ideas that the lean startup group kind of missed. So the funny thing is I have a beef with every single framework that's out there, which is when you distill something down to a point where it's kind of at a very high level, like build, measure, learn. Well, what does build mean? What does measure mean? What does learn mean? And that's actually where we're getting caught up. And the problem is that everything can kind of fit in there. So if we come back to this one, right? When we're trying to learn something about people, we can just map in there too. Here's our empathize stage and our actual define stage. So when we're trying to learn, in our build, so we talked about, right, all the sort of things we do to build a great product. What are some of the things you guys do to figure out what you think your customers want? What are some of the practices you use to figure out what it is that you're going to build next, startup or established company?
Interviews.
Great.
And observation.
Great. Observation.
Is that all in the define stage though, where you're defining what the product is you want based upon the fact of what the information you get from that source is?
From the design thinking stage?
Right.
So great question. So the empathy stage,
That gets you the emotional aspect,
Right.
right? But the define stage is the intellectual part about defining the key points of it, is what the problem is they have and how the solution that's going to resolve it, right?
exactly. So that's where, so you're already pointing out the fact, and I'll admit right now, this is where I'm mapping them in. So that's why I'd say the persona is kind of that defined piece in the learn, right? I'm trying to learn. It's like, okay, I've defined down what it is that my customer is, but the customer interviews is what's building that empathy. The persona is actually what's defining it. What's interesting, so already, we're starting to dig out is that if we just look at kind of a lean startup approach and I'm trying to learn, I might go straight, it's like, okay, well, I already know my customer, let me just create a persona, right? That's a learn stage, like, hey, whoa, get out of the building, right? So this is, everyone's heard that famous phrase, right? Get out of the building. Steve Blank, I think, is famous for saying that. That's that learn stage again, and it's actually, he wants you to get empathy. But it wasn't as clear for me. It was kind of like we missed that piece. And so one of the things that was missing a little bit in my opinion, in front of the kind of main lean startup movement was some of the empathy piece specifically that came from design thinking. That the design thinking folks, if you talk to anyone that was, any of my friends that were the design thinkers, they will come out and go, well, they're not empathizing, they're not getting out there and really understanding what the problem is. So, yeah.
I don't know exactly what empathy is, but what I see is the key difference between lean startup and design thinking is what Donald Rumsfeld called the unknown unknowns.
Great.
When you look at what Steve Blank writes on his blog, he's very explicit that startups don't do raw exploration in customer development. Customer development does not include raw exploration. It doesn't include going into observing a customer without a hypothesis.
Right.
Or interviewing a customer without a hypothesis and doing very little exploration.
Right.
And I was always shocked. I was shocked when I discovered, because I just assumed all along, when I first started hearing about lean startup and get out of the building and customer development, I assumed, well, of course, there's testing and hypotheses in these interviews, but there's also some raw exploration that can be done.
Right.
And Steve Blank is very explicit. No, that's design thinking.
Yep. And
I guess he gets to decide because he coined the term customer development.
Right, and so you're exactly right. And so we're already pointing out the fact that where I've come from is there is no perfect framework. It's the one where it helps you inside of a company know that you're building the product that you hope to be building. So it wouldn't be like, oh, we're doing design thinking instead of lean startup now. And it's like, no, because actually the beef with design thinking, so here's the other half of it. So design thinking is notoriously good at this. Like they're really, really great, and they're really great here. Which another way to look at it is, so if I have the idea or I have a customer I want to go talk to, all of a sudden I had this singular opinion and I go talk to people, and all of a sudden I'm learning so much, right? All of these options, it just grows really, really big. And then, to the gentleman's point up here, when I go back and define, I'm like, okay, well, I think I'm going after this persona. And then I come back and I'm like, what are all the possible ways that I could help this customer? And I can get really big again. And then they come back and prototype. The funny thing is that sometimes design thinking actually isn't as good at this second half. And the reason, to be honest, this is where you have to look at where some of these frameworks actually came from. So IDEO itself, they are contracted by people like Apple or Colgate or somewhere else to discover what is it, something that the customers don't know they want yet, and then they go build it. So they never take it to, their prototype and test is very different than my definition of prototype and test when I'm at an established company, right? I have to take it to finish. They kind of take it to that idea stage, here's a possible new business sector for you. Here, business, go and make it into a business now.
Can you talk about that?
Yeah.
Is that like the testing to $1? Like if somebody's actually willing to pay you $1 to be able to take that idea, or what are the difference in those testing ideas? Those are really important.
Oh, from like this test versus like
From the mainstream large corporate test versus a small startup test.
Yeah.
Just because those are the kinds of ideas that you actually
Yeah.
know your idea is actually worth anything, right? If somebody's willing to pay you $1 or not.
Mm-hmm. So excellent. What we're talking about is the build.
Yeah.
So let's push ahead. So
Sure.
this learn, this empathy, I added your unknowns, unknowns. You know, we could also, just to fill this out, so in case we don't come back, you know, could also be referred to as customer development. So, like I said, this learn bucket, it's got a lot of stuff in there. There's a lot of practices. What I've kind of discovered sometimes in a company, people will get good at one of them, like they interview people, but then they don't really understand what it means to develop the customer, or they only use A/B testing, or you know, or they only learn in a certain way. So there's no right way to learn. There is no do it this way every time and you will hit jackpot. So if we hit to the build stage, actually, and let's keep mapping our design thinking into there. So it's kind of, we'll say my hypothesis right now is that ideate and prototype live in here. So your test that you were asking about. And when it comes to the testing piece, which are you at an established company or a startup, or I'm trying to?
I don't know. I got like 10 employees. Nothing
Okay.
too big.
Okay, that's fine. So I actually, to your point, I actually think this is the hardest thing I see people trying to figure out, is the hypothesis stuff. And what I should share with you guys.
If this
What
is
I
totally
actually-
throwing you off, then
No,
you
it's
gotta
not.
just
See,
skip it.
see what you've hit on
Yeah.
is like, there is no process for experimentation. Well, actually there is a longer one, I just can't teach it to you in 10 minutes, right? This is where it gets complicated, but no, that's fine. So in the prototyping stage, I actually think that one of the biggest issues that startups sometimes don't, actually, I'm gonna take that back. Everybody doesn't actually test something as small as they think they can. So it's usually too big. And it's more of a question, and the funny thing is we talk about it all the time, that Eric Ries kind of said, I think in his book, or somebody said, you know, if you're shipping it and you're proud of it, then you waited too long.
Reed Hoffman.
What?
Reed Hoffman.
Thank you. Thank you. I see. Great. Was it in like one of his books, or was it just in
It's LinkedIn. It just
okay.
made an offhanded comment about it. The guy who founded LinkedIn.
Great. And actually, I just heard a talk from him, and he was kind of the guy, he's like, some of the best companies are product focused, not process focused. Which is, again, it's like, okay, I have this hypothesis, and literally it's like, what do I believe? How many of you go into meetings and just talk about the next feature you need to build? Really? Like requirements lists, like we need to go build this feature, right? This is the feature we're building. That's the kind of the conversations we tend to talk about. If you just stop for one moment and think about the next feature you're gonna go build tomorrow, or that your company is working on, realize right now that that's a total guess. It's a total assumption that your customer wants that. And the ultimate experiment, can anyone guess what the ultimate experiment is? The ultimate experiment that will absolutely tell you if you're right or not.
Ask them for the money.
Huh?
Ask them for the money.
Close.
Give me $1.
No, just ship it.
Yeah.
Shipping it is an experiment. I mean, when you ship your product, like when we were doing 3 to 6 month development cycles, that was a freaking experiment. You know, you found out at the end of 3 months whether you were actually going to be successful or not. So the question is, how can you actually bring that down into smaller pieces? So I will try to give you guys the quick, like, not 30 second, but 5 minute kind of grid that I discovered. So I'm sharing some of the stuff I discovered with you guys. So when it comes to experiments, like when we say, okay, I have a hypothesis, I have an assumption, I'm not sure I know something, I don't care what you guys call it, right? There's a couple different ways you could go learn about it. And to be honest, actually, I think I might have pulled this one from Steve Blank. But there's kind of 2 places we can look. One, we can look directly at, we can directly observe what our customers do, okay? We can indirectly, right, observe what they do. And then also we can directly observe what they say. So when we think about all the different ways we experiment, it actually falls in one of these places. So what's a common what's one experiment approach?
Split test?
Split test, A/B testing. Okay, so A/B testing, we don't get to watch the customer using it, so we know it's an indirect observation, and we're getting metrics back. So we're going to indirectly observe what they do. Great. What else?
Well, there's an ethnographic study where you're directly observing.
Great, yeah, so they kind of call it the anthropologist approach. So that kind of goes into different, I call those kind of the different interviewing approaches. So sometimes people miss it when it comes to customer interviews. You can have a different, the term I actually like to use when it comes to interviews, when you go into an interview, depending on what you want to learn, decide what your stance is, okay? So in this case, when you're talking about it, so I can directly observe what they're doing. So this would be, I'm going to create some new accounting software, and so what I do, I talk to a potential customer, and I'm like, can I just show up at your office and follow your accountant around? So I'm going to be an anthropologist for a day. I may have not spelled anthropologist, so that's fine. Okay, what else?
Value pricing, value-based pricing, basically tier pricing.
And then how would you test that? How would you,
Let's see which ones the customers are willing to pay for.
and how would you put it in front of them?
I'd give them a matrix of price options.
Okay, so you sit down with them, and you
I just say, here's my line card. You want product,
great.
A with the streamlined features, lower price, or do you want? It's a version of A/B testing, but it's with
Great.
different tiers of features.
So that's great. So if you were sitting in front of them, so this is a perfect example. Right? You're probably sitting down with them and you're waiting to see what they say. Right? It's like, will you buy this?
More what they do. It's which one are they going to buy?
Oh, it's actually like making an ask.
Yeah.
Okay. So I don't know. We could call that. Well, I'll just put it up here.
That seems more like indirect observation.
Well, if this is on
as
it-
he mentions, it's a little bit like an A/B test.
Yeah, maybe.
It's multiple options. It's one of the two options.
Well, and then what I was going at is depending is especially as a startup, if you're kind of testing it on people, but you're not really well, how much would you pay? I've actually seen it kind of, what would they say? And the funny thing is a lot of people rely too much on this category, right? When we know,
Definitely.
right? So what do you think? So what goes in here, just so we can feel it? So this, if you're indirectly observing what people say,
Is that like Twitter?
yes, yes. Thank you. This is the research. So this comes out when you're starting a company, what's the first thing you do? You indirectly figure out what people are saying and what their interest is, and you kind of watch what's going on. Okay. But it also means if you're well, I want to design an experiment, how might I go after it? What I find a lot of times in companies is I'll either find them only doing customer interviews in one of these two places, right? They're sitting in front of someone. They're only doing one type, or they're only doing A/B testing, or heck, they're just getting on the internet all the time and not really going at it. So people favor one of these. So one way you could look at, just kind of where are we experimenting? Where are we learning? And you can already see, right, each of these come with a certain level of value in the experimentation itself. Yeah? I'll let you take pictures of my paper when I'm done. So what I'd say is in this prototype is I think about, right, this kind of grid here about how am I observing my customers. And right, the whole get out of the building thing was because people were spending too much time in this indirect and they tried to shift them over. Interestingly, then they're well, I'll just ask them what they want. It's no, So the funny thing is, like, a lot of like the Steve Blank stuff is he's trying to figure out, this is what customer development is a lot of times. It's figuring these sort of things out. Is how can I discover, right? True discovery. Being an anthropologist, a lot of it tends to live up here sometimes initially, but at the same time, you got to see. The other thing is, as we also know, right? There, the law of if I watch people do things, they don't always behave right. So I do still need to indirectly kind of look. But different types of experiments call for those different approaches. So did I capture some of your question?
All of it.
Yeah.
Marvelous.
Okay. So let's finish out this build circle here. So I mapped in, just as if sometimes people are familiar with the design thinking stuff. I actually think one of the things that design thinking has that lean startup has not been good at as either. So we could keep pulling from both is ideation. I mean, I've learned these problems. I've interviewed people. How many people go straight to building? First idea. First idea is never our best. I mean, and that's actually why people have built in iterations. But even before building code, there's lots of, this is where, again, because we have the limited amount of time, I like to do things I call design studios. If you have an IXD on your team or UX person, they might be familiar kind of with this term. But it comes down to, it's visual brainstorming. It's brainstorming with a group of people about what are the multiple ways that we could solve this problem, and how do we experiment and test those things. Not test the yes or no on one product, but testing, a little bit more of, you had to, in order to do an A/B test, you would have needed to do this ideation stage. The sad thing is, and I'm sorry if you're doing this, please stop. I've gone to companies where they're like, yes, we're doing A/B testing. I'm like, cool, what are you testing? We're figuring out what font increases the click-through rate of our page. I'm like, oh my gosh, that's not speeding you up. And it's just because they started off, we need to be doing A/B testing. I'm like, well, the whole point of this was to understand if we could change their behavior through indirect observation. Your hypothesis was the font? Really? Okay. That might be one of those things where I'd say, I would just throw it up there and see, and just make sure you don't crash your page. Doing an A/B test and something like that, it's still an investment. So the last thing to consider when you're prototyping or deciding how you're going to experiment, right? Each of these experiments come with a cost. So considering not just what your interview stance is, but also, right, how much it's actually sometimes when people are talking about experiments, they'll do this, how much learning will I get? And then how much is this going to cost? And they'll do one of these things where they'll be like, well, we could ship it, which is, way up here. It's going to cost us a lot, and we're going to learn a whole bunch. But where are there other things where I could learn a little bit less? Actually, does anyone know how they experimented on Google Glass? If you haven't seen it, go. We don't have time to watch the video. We will tomorrow, but. They actually, the Google Design Labs actually put out a video about how they experiment with Google Glass. So if I was to ask you guys, how long do you think it took them to prototype and to create the first experiment and prototype for Google Glass? If it was you, 6 months? 3 months? A day? Yeah, well, because Google, right? So most people, it's like, that was me. What?
Over a year.
Yeah, over a year. I mean.
I know one woman who's, although she calls it the A-type, not prototype, it was a watch kind of thing. It
Yeah.
was that big. Her problem was her target market had to have one the size of yours.
Yeah, there you go. So the interesting thing is, so to the day comment, right? So they looked at it and they said, well, what are all the assumptions about this thing? Well, the first thing they came up with was that, and I don't know exactly what, but one of them was, well, we know we're going to have to hang electronics off of the glasses. Can we even do that? So they weighed all of the components, they added up all the weight of the components, they got some clay, got one of the guy's glasses and stuck a chunk of clay on it and had the guy walk around for a day. That was the first experiment for Google Glass. And then they did a bunch of fun stuff where they're like, well, and then we should do Minority Report where people are waving their hands and doing this cool stuff. And so they set up, they had a projector backpack, and they put like actually almost something like this, like a projector out over the guy, and they had him he had like coat hangers, and he could do this, and it just was swiping something, and all of a sudden, how long do you want to hold your hands like this for? Okay, all of a sudden they were like, oh, maybe Minority Report's not as cool as we thought it was. And also walking around like this down the street looks a little wonky. So it was just, what was interesting is before they ever laid out any boards, before they wrote any code. Now that's, a startup example, but they got massive amounts of learning for the cost of string and some clay and a paperclip. Okay, yeah.
I mean, that seems like, from my experience, that's like the really easy learning. For most people, building prototypes and doing products is the safe stuff for people to go out and do. The more challenging stuff, it is like to get out of the building where, how did Google go about testing that, we can get away with charging $2,000 for this?
For finding, yeah. Well, I mean, so that piece there, so if you go back to customer development, so we talked about the startups. So, and I do hit this tomorrow, but I'll hit it really quick. One of the important things about customer development, actually this is true for any company, and especially if you're trying to go into a new sector, is remembering that the way your customers behave, right? Everyone knows this drawing, right? Okay. Yep. And actually there, right now, right, if anyone's following Google Glass, they're not so sure they're gonna make this. Because who they successfully sold to their first market. So people were willing to buy it for $1,000. What they didn't figure out was how to jump the chasm. So that's kind of a whole nother, they're having to go back and, figure out if there's, whether it was the social issues or the tribe, whether they can get it adopted or not. So it's a good question. That's probably why I think they hit most of their innovators, and maybe that they didn't even get into the early majority yet. So. Okay.
After that search Google, it hasn't done much at all when it goes to original.
Yeah. Yeah.
You mentioned why do we do A/B testing? You said change just the customer behavior. Just mention a little more about that.
Changing customer behavior?
What you meant by what you're referring to?
Absolutely. What's my time?
You're at 7:30. Great. Half hour.
I have half hour? Okay. Because I'm going to draw new pictures.
Go for it.
I've got to know, do I start the new picture or do I keep barreling ahead? So this is what. Okay. So this is actually one of my favorite my favorite questions. So I feel like that was a plant. So thank you for answering that question. But it's such a great one because I think fundamentally this even goes back to why. Why do we do this? And when we got stuck in that process cycle, what kind of happened? So. If I kind of consider why do we build products? Why do our companies exist? It's because there are these unhappy people in the world that are unhappy, sad, or just downright pissed off. Okay? And this is the world now. And right, what happened is we either started a company or there's someone in our company, and it's we have this cool idea, and I think if we build it, we'll make some money and we'll do all these other cool things. So this is the world now. So the way we're going to change that, right, is we start building stuff. We go through some Agile cycles, or we do some development, and hopefully at the end of that, through some great experiments, we deliver something into the world. And the world later, right, we get happy customers. And they're pretty awesome, and they're still a pissed off customer because you can't make everyone happy. And so that ends up being our world later. So here's the interesting part. When we had this idea in most companies, so right, this is where it's we get our hypotheses, we have certain ideas, they become features. they become requirements and specifications. I used to work for companies where I had to write requirements documents, and you signed off on them. Hope you guys never had to go through this. And you signed off on them, and then you're like, well, we don't have time to build that. And it's like, well, it's a requirement. I'm like, well, you don't have time. I'm like, but it's a requirement. And what she really just meant was just fucking build it. I was like, okay, fine. But really, that wasn't right, because what was happening was that all of this stuff here, when we were delivering things along the way, this was all output. I just delivered stuff. It's just output. And so we started living this world where we measured things. We measured velocity. We measured lines of code. We measured unit tests. It was output stuff because it was measurable. But what we missed the fact was that what we actually wanted was we wanted a new outcome. And we know that we've gotten an outcome because the thing that people were doing before, they've actually changed the way that they behave later when they picked up our product. So if anyone starts a startup company, what's your biggest competitor when you're starting a company?
The old way.
Yes, the status quo. The status quo is your biggest competitor. It's not another company. It's the very fact that when you build a new feature, even if it's a new feature in your product, the way they're using it today is your biggest competitor. So every time you deliver a feature, you're actually trying to change someone's behavior. That's what you're testing for. You're testing for behavior change. You're testing to see if the outcome that when you delivered this feature, they actually got the thing they thought they were going to get because they worked in a new way. So that's what I mean when I say that they work in a new way. But here's an interesting catch too. So I built some new outcomes. The thing is it's so great, we can measure that, right? Through A/B tests. And we can measure that through customer interviews and NPS scores and things like that. But in reality, there was you have a company. And probably when you decided to do something, you were like, well, we're spending a lot of money and we need to ship something. So hopefully over here, when you actually shipped that new thing, you actually had an impact on the company. So that's what we call impact, right? You had your ROIs, your money. The problem is that each of these have a delay in your company when you're measuring it. And so in companies, process lives in here. We're just delivering this stuff. And we love to measure these things. But the reason for a lot of this the lean startup stuff and design thinking and experimenting is what I would love you guys to start learning how to do or thinking about it differently. If you were to think differently about one thing, is to actually I'm trying to figure out how to help people, if I can spell it right, minimize this. And I actually want to maximize this. Right? Makes sense? So, if we look at everything we're trying to do, every time we're trying to put a framework in place, we're actually only trying to work on this part of the company versus really thinking about the larger kind of approaches that you take that figure out how to get this larger kind of impact. I mean, an impact can also come to, there's a lot of, the socially responsible companies or not impact-driven, or companies, trying to make real kind of social change, or I forget what, there's the new rating companies can get when they do good for the people. Anyway, can't remember what it is right now. But anyway, that's that impact piece. It takes time to see that. Like the Whole Foods kind of effect. Thank you. Yeah?
So this goes back a little bit to when you were mentioning Agile earlier.
Yeah.
Back in the day, many years ago, they used to talk about big upfront design.
Yeah.
And that was kind of, maybe that's the reason we need to do Agile, we need to do the kind of iterative groups, is to deal with the risks that come from big upfront, replace the big upfront design. But then way back then, there were already people that were saying BUFR. big upfront requirements, we're just as much, if not more, risk.
Mm-hmm.
And that kind of relates to this. It's the big upfront design is kind of in the middle. The big upfront the middle part is trying to deal with the problems of the big upfront design. And when you expand out a little bit, you're looking at the outcomes. That's getting more into, well, wait a second, my assumptions about the requirements and how the users were going to end up using this in the first place may be wrong. So I need to include that.
Exactly right. So it's how can I figure out sooner if I'm getting the outcomes that I hope for, which is a lot of, again, that, right, if I'm product focused in my company and I'm trying to change people's behaviors and the outcomes and change what they're doing, why am I measuring my output? Right? So actually to that, I don't want to use this one yet, we gotta finish this one. So I draw the whole, we'll say, Agile process differently now, okay? And for anyone who owns, does anyone own a company in here or is responsible for the process itself? Okay, this might upset you, I'm sorry, okay? It's a reality check. So the nice thing about Agile, well, I'll say Agile in quotes, whatever version, is it's this nice measurable thing, right? There was this, it was like this warm blanket where I could measure how much stuff I could get into each bucket. But the funny thing is, if you look into it, it's like, well, where's the stuff coming that you're putting into the bucket, like that you're actually building? You have to go figure out what that stuff is. And it's impossible to measure that piece. We kept trying to measure everything, right? If we could just measure, we could figure out how much time and cost, and we just kind of made our heads explode a little bit. And with the lean, right, all the lean stuff, it's this stuff going on, right? It's like I got to do all these experiments and these different loops as fast as possible. And hopefully as I learn stuff, I'm dropping that down into my delivery. So I drew, this is just kind of a different version of what I drew earlier is in a more established company, this is kind of how they think about it. Is you have to start thinking about the fact that you have to balance this discovery and delivery at any point. Now, one team should be doing this, which means in reality from the outside, you know, it's like, okay, I can still execute on the stuff that is kind of known, but then I got this other stuff going on top of it that's kind of unmeasured. So if I start doing any sort of output measurement, it's, who knows what it's going to look like. But, you know, again, it doesn't, I don't care, because maybe at this point it was like, just get it done. We know exactly what we need for our customer. And down here was, let's go do a lot more problem interviews and really figure out what it is that our customer wants. Or I don't think we've really, you know, figured out exactly what this is yet. Or, you know, let's spend a little bit more time on the customer, but still be delivering some things at the same time. Now as a company, you get to, you know, instead in your each 2-week sprints, you know, think of it like the bucket. You go, okay, how full am I going to fill it with my normal just delivery stuff, and how much am I going to add in for discovery? And that changes every time. So you can leverage Agile as a way to say, every week or two, I actually decide, hey, I know we need to go do some discovery. Let's give ourselves permission to go experiment. Not, oh no, I promised 50 points of stuff. I have to, you know, the whole Agile movement, if you talk to those people, their goal was not to trap people into, you know, a time box. It was to help people plan better. And the promise is that their definition was creating a stable velocity. Well, if you're doing that, that team cannot be doing any sort of lean startup activities. So that's where we're seeing the shift, the thinking shift kind of change a little bit. To your point, to your point about the Agile waterfall, I know way too much about this really weird history stuff. This picture first showed up in like 1973 in a paper, okay? And right now I'm forgetting the gentleman's name, so I apologize, but there's a research paper and he talks about software development, or, you know, development at the time, and he's like, you know, it's, you know, you go down this waterfall process, but you have to remember that sometimes you learn things and you have to go back. And sometimes you have to go back. And sometimes you have to go do more stuff. And the funny thing is on the very first page, there was the simple one, and then 5 pages in was this ridiculous, like 2-page diagram. And strangely enough, he in the book, in quotes, there's some place that when it's just the 4 boxes going one after another, he goes, this approach invites risk, don't do it. And then he goes on to, in a very complicated and PhD way, explain iterative development, which made no sense to anyone, so they went back to the first page and said, we'll do that. Okay. So that, I feel bad for this guy, because I think he's rolling over going, that's not what I meant! Okay. And then it took us like another 40 years to figure out what he meant, okay? So that poor guy, we created an entire institute around project management around something that the guy didn't actually need. So I want to finish with this last piece here for you guys to at least kind of finish out. And we've hit on some of these things. So right, if we had one final step just to bring in the design thinking piece, which is that they do their test, right? Which is what's going on in here. We're checking. Now, something I actually like to add in here. So one thing is I actually consider hypothesis to be kind of its own little extra step that's missing. I think lean startup and design thinking are even missing some pieces. Like, hey, what's your hypothesis and what are some of your assumptions? There's a couple other things you can think about in there. And so something that's often missed in the test phase is the fact that you need to do something with the data that you got. People are like, I ran an A/B test. Like, well, what did you learn? That's the point of the measuring, is that you get some data out and then you can put it back into your learn cycle. And a lot of people miss the actual stage of like stopping and going, hey, did we validate something? And it's okay to invalidate something. I actually had someone say to me once, if you are doing experimentation well, you should be wrong 60% of the time. Because if you are not doing it well and you're right, and you're actually right most of the time, then you're not actually discovering anything. You're not discovering what you could be doing. All you're doing is making yourself feel better that you were right. So what's interesting about that is, if we think about that, and we go back to thinking about our experiments or ideating, imagine specifically designing experiments that might fail, like putting in a red herring. So a really common approach would be doing an A/B, maybe C test in front of somebody, and having to try to convince your designer to put in a design that's just a little bit nuts. And it sounds like everyone's like, oh yeah, whatever. I can't tell you what teams people are like, actually, A's fine and B's fine, but the C, I mean, it's a little wonky, but I kind of like what's going on in this part of it. And all of a sudden you get like an A plus C. And that's where you start getting the innovative sort of things. And it's going back to, right, if we're doing good customer development and we're learning about our customers and we're finding some of those innovators, it's safer to fail. That's why we always have that big term like safe to fail. If you guys don't feel safe to fail, then you're not learning either. It doesn't mean you ship the weird thing, you test the weird thing, right? So the test, this is right, we kind of talked about how you can figure out how to do different interviews, you can do the actual A/B test itself. The specific thing though about the test is what makes a test? What has to exist?
Hypothesis.
Hypothesis? What else? How will you know if your test passed or failed?
A model.
Your model.
Results, data.
Results, data.
Stimulus.
Yes. I'm going to use the term metrics, but all those things. You gotta know, like, it's in the hypothesis, right? A good hypothesis isn't just, I believe my customers will like this. It's the how do you know they will do it. If you go Google like hypothesis statements, the end of it will always be, and it's how will you know? So if you do an A/B test, it's like, what were you expecting to happen and how will you know? It's amazing how many people don't actually watch their funnels. So the big thing here, who's heard of the R metrics, pirate metrics? So I'll give you lots of terms you can Google for later. So parametrics is just a common approach of, they're thinking about it from kind of a sales funnel, but if you really think about metrics, just think about your product. I'm going to assume most everyone in here is using software products, but in a software product, there is a journey that your customer has to make in order to reach the behavior change or the value proposition or the outcome that you wanted. And if you're watching them go through it and you know when they bail from your product, you can do some testing around that. So you want to watch for that data. Too many people just release their code into the world and then they start, the worst thing I see is that people start developing features like, oh, I have to make this user experience better. I'm like, well, how many of your customers actually reach that? Like 10% of them. I'm like, well, where do the other 90% go? Well, they log in once and never come back. I'm like, maybe you're working on the wrong part of your product. Okay. So it's sometimes the shiny objects of the new things, it just stops us from, that's so sad, right? Only 10% of their customers are actually getting the outcome that we had hoped for, right? They missed the fact they kept focusing on output and they didn't actually realize that the outcome they thought they had delivered to the customer actually never happened. They got stuck in this view. Okay. So, that's my pretty scary kind of process up here. So it's, everything, the reason I kind of like to look at this, every time someone comes up to me with kind of a new approach. So actually, has anyone heard, one we actually haven't even put in here yet is story mapping. Are people familiar with story mapping? Right, story mapping, I'd be like, cool, story mapping is great for understanding my customer's world now. I can actually use it to help focus in what part of the problem they're working on, or I could use it to map out what my next MVP is and show it to a customer to check to actually use that as an experiment. So every tool that I've run into somehow helps me do one of these things a little bit better, or it's a new approach I can experiment with in that stage. So, if I was gonna leave one thing with you guys is that there's no true and tried specific approach to test this thing out. You'll kind of figure out which ones you're good at and then keep asking around, because I hope that, over time, this just keeps filling up with more and more approaches. And so whenever I work with a company or a startup, instead of saying, here's a formal approach and here's the pretty version of what you should do, it's much more, well, where are you at? What are you trying to test? What are you trying to learn? Cool, have you tried mapping? This would be a great time to find an A/B test. Maybe you should just go watch your customer. And you have to bring your smarts into it. Because I have a friend that's trying to kind of write a book about something like product discovery, and I'm like, I don't know how you're gonna write that book. Because I think this is where it's just a community, especially a lean startup community, we can continue to help this sort of stuff grow. Because if we just keep thinking about it as, well, just do lean startup. Lean startup is the bucket. It's like saying do Agile, right? And then we have to figure out what are the pieces and the things specific to our environment and culture that can actually help us do it well. Okay. But remember this stuff, right? Don't get lost in here. Because remove stuff. Has anyone ever removed features from their product? Yay! Yay! Okay, good. That number's going up too, but that's to that point, right? You realized it wasn't about adding more output, it was about building that outcome. Okay, that's a mind shift already. Cool. Q&A.
I was going to say one thing that we kind of going along with removing, just adding fake buttons. I can see who clicks them.
Yes, the 404, I love that one. Right? That's actually a little bit here.
Without actually building it and then testing demand, it's an easy way to test demand.
Yeah, I call that the 404, which is if someone, then you just, actually you put a message and go, did you want this feature? We'll email you or can we talk to you?
Obviously it has to be done tastefully.
Yes. Actually, to be honest, I had a friend that was helping Travelocity, and they did a whole bunch of that. Whoever saw the 404 page on Travelocity, exactly. They said, I only want to test this on like 100 people. So the likelihood that they actually annoyed some people is actually pretty low. So that's another, you know, when it comes to the safe to fail, they didn't have all their customers calling pissed off. They only found 100 of them. So, yeah.
So when you talk about toolbox, that reminds me of what some of my design thinking friends talk about. There's apparently a little bit of a controversy about whether design thinking really happens in a sequence and is a process, or is it really just a set of activities that you choose depending on the circumstances.
Yes.
In a sequence that's not predefined necessarily.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. Like the true design thinking starts doing stuff like this, which is actually goes back to the main point of that because we are in a discovery mode versus a delivery mode, it's not about being sequential, but I think it is about being very conscious about what you're trying to learn and why you're doing it. Because still with the design thinking, if you notice there, and even in the, in any of these, you kind of either are trying to learn more or define, or get, it's a lot like, is it time to focus now or is it time to get big now? And, it just changes the approach where instead of like, I just need to go down this path, and delivering right now, and just giving space for that. So yeah, there's not, it's the truth for this, obviously, if I prototype something and then I kind of realize I'm wrong, or I have some hypothesis, or I realize, my hypothesis has too many assumptions, I could go back here. So that's why to be honest, that's a lot of times why I do a lot of this in drawings, is because if I put them into formalized PowerPoint slides, all of a sudden people are like, this is the way. Psychology. Yeah.
So it kind of fits into all the different methodologies created, like this circle, whatever you want to call it. You try to find most project management, trying to get ready to be is linear. So if you're any new innovative project management software that maybe helps you follow this circular approach. And maybe let you know what stage you're in. Maybe if there's anything critical, like at this point you don't get paid, you're going to continue the circle. Are there ways to identify those parts that are mission critical so you can continue going?
So what I've seen people do is actually create discovery boards. So they'll use something like, to be honest, they'll either use just a board or they'll use Trello. So that's where they pull from Agile and they go, wow, visualizing where something is in its kind of process, or in its flow makes sense. So I have this huge opportunity I'm working on, and then I've come up with a set of hypotheses I need to test, and these are being tested and then here's how the test passed. So there's actually, there's a couple companies, I think Javelin is one that came up with an experiment board. There's people that are starting to do that, which it forces into linear, but they'll tell you at any point a card might go backwards because, or cards fall off the board because you invalidated the hypothesis. But I encourage people product managers in companies to have a discovery board just like their team has. And so the end of the discovery board ultimately is, great, build it. Build it for real, production ready, build it. Because in my phase, I was prototyping some stuff. So that would be the first stage, but it's don't measure it. So here's the thing you can't take from Agile is don't measure discovery. If, the only thing that I might measure is how long someone's taking to do discovery, because if they're doing if they're oh, well, we're doing an experiment that's 3 weeks long, and I'm like, that's where's my loops? The value of learning is speed. So all of a sudden, if you have a 3 week, it looks like your learning loops like this, you're back to big requirement documents. So the one thing it's you should be validating and invalidating, established companies, we're happy if we get it done in 2 weeks, and they were like, great, do it in 1 week, and they freak out. And we're like, great, do it in 3 days, and then they freak out, and then all of a sudden they're doing a couple a day. Because an experiment could be talking to a customer and putting them in front of something. So that's where it's becomes very specific to a company, and there's probably not. That's why the software ends up being simple things like a Trello board, because they need to adapt it to their own approach.
I've seen a lot of people using Trello there.
I have, or if they're in a co-working space, Post-it notes, because if the experiments are going so quickly, by the time they write it into a card, they've talked to someone, they've been validated and made a new card, it's not worth the tracking aspect of it. Like there's just, the metric would be how many experiments am I doing in a week? That would be a number that would be valuable to me. But again, if they're stupid experiments, like I did 5 A/B tests to measure font sizes, I'm like, okay, well now we're getting silly. Now you're like, we did 50 experiments. I'm like, but those didn't really, those weren't valuable experiments. They weren't good hypotheses. So. Questions?
Yeah, my hang up has been, first of all, it may be two of the same things. First of all, you said your background's working with big companies. And then the small ones, but the ones in the middle, you hear about, like maybe Google or Facebook or something. And they may have started small, but what's missing when you go through all this is the role of architecture and the role of a consistent user interface. It's a hang up. I mean, you give a programmer lines and they go off and they come up with their own design for what it's going to look like because you want to see how they react to it. At some point, that Facebook page was what it is now. At some point, the database was laid out. It's very expensive to go back and change the design of the database.
Yeah, so that's, I mean, it's getting into a level deeper, but I'll hit on it really quickly, is that when it comes to discovery in more established companies, to be honest, is that we end up creating what we call a discovery team. And that consists of a tech lead usually, and then a product manager, and then often an a UX or an IXD. And then if there's a company initiative, so we a lot of times refer to this as the discovery triad. A lot of times there'll be like an overarching one for sort of a business initiative that then is responsible to work with these folks. So there's still, just like Agile scaled, there's a lot of people. There are people that are scaling it out so that those sort of things are watched. So a lot of times, like if there's a specific initiative to deliver something, the actual UI person here and the dev person here are acting as that architect and the lead, and they're making sure that those teams are, once the experiments are done, that then they do create, this is the one time it's like you create documentation that supports them in order to follow a specific design approach.
I hear you say that therefore all this stuff you showed, all these other sheets is like maybe the first year and you finally discovered and you went back and just restarted. And you had to go get money. We do get tranches for, usually it's to expand your sales.
No, it really is it's a lot more about the iterative development. So I worked with a company that scaled from 75 to 800 people. And, they eventually pulled out an architecture team, but,
it wasn't until they were 800 that they had an architecture team.
Well, to that point,
Don't feel bad. Microsoft went all the way to, I forgot what the number was before they had an architecture team, before they had a systems quality group.
This is, I don't know, has anyone recently, so here's maybe something that, I will admit I have not done coding in a long time, and I don't get into the architecture stuff as much, but the companies that have finally hit it head on are the ones that are doing it. Every team can ship it. So I don't know if you're familiar, like LinkedIn, does anyone realize what they just started working on, so I just heard an interview with their current CEO, and they just overhauled their technical environment so that every team, they pulled out their quality production release team, and now every team goes straight to the server, which is essentially like Facebook does that, and Netflix and those sort of folks. So everyone's responsible for architecture environment, and everyone's responsible for following a design pattern.
Now that sounds more like you now have a well-architected system. So you can say the bedrooms here and have a bedroom specialist work on the bedroom, the bathrooms here. And if you've got a large,
really hear you
Michael, yeah, well,
Oh, sorry.
I'm saying that's when you do have an architect. Michael Dell did this huge mansion, and then he could put the guys in the theater loose. Then he could put the people in the guest house or the guest areas loose.
No, at this point, it's a accountability to everyone on the team to not break it. So the shift that I'm seeing now is to actually remove compartmentalization of teams. So I'm happy, to be honest, I'm happy to introduce you to someone if you want to talk to them about it from a technical point of view.
I think that's closer to what you're saying. Recently, I was on a session where the chief architect of TurboTax was on a panel.
Okay.
He talked about how he entered TurboTax when they were still majorly desktop products, and how you shift to being more mobile, more web, everything. And they basically talked about having to re-architect this huge architecture, and it was starting slow. He said you had to start piece by piece. You have to figure out which routes you can move to be in that more microservices type of architecture. And it took a little while, but it was what you were saying. It's decoupling the front end from the back end, but allowing each team to move forward quickly and be able to.
So what I'm seeing is people from day one now are realizing that they need to have, like, there's a lot of companies are architecting based on platforms and then services on top of that. But why don't we, I'm just being conscious of the time, so I'm happy to continue the conversation. Scaling architecture is a whole, do things that don't scale thing, but it doesn't matter if you don't have a product that builds outcomes and don't reach your market. So I'm happy to hang out for a little bit longer and answer any other questions, and I will leave my pieces of paper up here if you wanted to take pictures of them. And thank you for everyone's questions and stuff like that. I really appreciate it.